people desperately need
Okay,
to
I
know,
will pass them over.
stop
No
me
worries.
and yeah.
No worries.
And we'll
That's
get
fine.
them at the end.
Okay, just wait a couple of minutes and we will just start.
Yeah, I've kept it quite short, hopefully, so it won't be too much of a, a dry talk on.
Yeah, but I
data
have seen your slides, and I think it's a fantastic overview because there could be people that they know how to do a data management plan. Some people that they know what is FAIR data, and some people that they know anything, you know.
Yeah, I've tried to keep it quite high level, just because I think a lot of this stuff can get very technical and detailed, and I think it's really just important to get the key messages. So
yeah,
I'll focus on that
good.
today.
That's a good perspective, and I have seen your slides, and I think they are very practical, which is when I do really think that is worth it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, good.
So you've got lots of people joining. That's great.
Yeah, that's nice. At least the PhD students, because it's kind of a part of the whole course, and also the different faculty, they have the choice to join one Open Science Café, two, or as many as they can, they want. Okay. So that's good. That's a good option, because to be free every single Thursday is difficult, but once or two. Yeah. So I want to make it very flexible, because if not, it's really frustrating, you know.
Yeah, so this is it going on all year, or is it just for this month? Or?
I have done for 6 sessions now, but I want to repeat another 6 sessions in the fall, something like late November, October, something like that. So because I think you cannot cover everything, so I would like to cover also data management experts on the, you know, these experiences of data stewards, somebody on that role. Also IPR issues in a very technical perspective, which is also something important. So let's see if we can repeat it, the series. But it has been very nice. Okay, so I think we may start, because it's 1:03. So, okay, welcome everybody to the 4th Open Science Café. I hope you can grab your coffee or your tea or whatever and enjoy this new talk that we have today with another important component of the open science. As you know, that is the open data, research open data, and how to deal with the data management plan and FAIR data, which is this fantastic acronym that appears in all the calls that you have to apply in the funders. They say you to make your data fair. What is this? This is a very difficult thing. So, but we have the first runner in the open data, on the FAIR data, which is Joy Davidson. That she's the coordinator of the United Kingdom Digital Curation Centre, which is a famous digital curation centre that they have been working on data management for years and years. They have developed a lot of tools. Actually, the tool that the university is using for data management plan and the Consorcio Madroño is the data curation tool into Spanish. So that's we are part of this work of they have been doing. And also Joy is now the coordinator of the Work Package 3 of FAIRsFAIR, which is one European project on infrastructures that the University Carlos III of Madrid is also a partner. And we are dealing with how to make this data on the European Open Science Cloud, on the new data-driven research, more fair. And Joy will tell you how to do it. So go ahead, the floor is yours. Well, the screen is yours. Thank you very much for accepting this. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Eva. And it's nice to, Eva mentioned all the projects. Eva and I actually work together on FAIRsFAIR, so it's nice that we can do this as well. So welcome to everybody today, and thank you for joining. I think over the last few sessions, you've been hearing an awful lot about open science. And it's important to remember that open science doesn't just happen. It takes a little bit of time and effort, and it takes some planning. So today's session is going to give you an introduction to data management planning. And I'm assuming that some of you have already heard this term and may know what it is. Others may have never heard of it before. So I'm hoping to give you a fairly high-level introduction to let you know what a data management plan is, to let you understand a little bit about the difference between FAIR data that Eva mentioned and open data, to give you a few pointers as to the kinds of things you should include in a data management plan, the sorts of issues you should think about, and I'll finish up, as Eva mentioned, with a little bit of a pointer to some free tools that you can use. So it'll be about 20 minutes, hopefully, for the talk, and plenty of time for us to have some questions afterwards. So first of all, I just wanted to give you a very brief run through of what is research data management. So this is basically just good research practice. It may sound like something new, but it shouldn't be. This is just the way people have always done research. It's about really thinking through how you're going to carry out your project, thinking about what you're going to create, how you're going to document it, who gets to use it in the short term, and how you might want to share it in the longer term, and thinking about how you'll store it and share it and preserve it. So it's really just about thinking about how you're going to look after what you produce in your research. That sort of takes a little bit of planning. So you can see I've circled at the top of this list, data management planning is a key aspect of research data management. So it's just one of the things you have to do, but it's essential that you start to think about this. And it's essential that you start to think about data management planning before you actually go into your research. So it'll help you to think about any of the challenges you might encounter along the way. And hopefully by thinking through it, you won't encounter those challenges. You'll make sure that you plan to mitigate any of those challenges before you encounter them. So it's good to start planning before you actually even do any research at all. So Eva mentioned this nice acronym FAIR data, and this is something you may have heard a lot about. It's very much a buzzword in Europe at the moment. FAIR data is essentially those data that are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think, you know, at a high level, everybody can get behind the notion of making your data fair. It just seems like a good thing to do. Somebody should be able to find and access and use my data if I'm getting money from the government or the European Commission to do some work. It's good that somebody else can come and make use of what I've produced. I think what you can see on this slide is that under each of those high-level terms, so under findable, there are a lot of things that actually that breaks down into in a more technical sense. A lot of this is to do with how you would describe your data so that somebody could find it. So things like having metadata, which is just a description about the data in a structured and standardized way, and having a globally persistent identifier, something that means that if somebody finds your data, they can actually come and access it, or at least get to the metadata so they know how to access it. So each of these principles, the FAIR data principles, has quite a lot of information under it. So while it's a nice acronym, and it is something I think everybody can agree with, when it comes to doing it in practice, it is a little bit technical. I think we're still getting our heads around it, both as data curators and as researchers, as to what it actually means. The findable and accessible part are generally a bit more easy to address than the interoperable and reusable, which tends to be a little bit more subjective based on who wants to reuse the data. As part of the work we've done in the FAIRsFAIR project, we've come up with a nice, easy-to-use tool, which is called FAIRaware. So if you do want to learn a little bit more about FAIR data, you can come and have a look at this tool. It takes about half an hour to run through. It's 10 questions. You just kind of run through them, and you get a sense of your own current level of awareness of the FAIR principles and how they might apply to your research. But I think what this slide can help to demonstrate is that if you do want to produce FAIR data in the course of your research, you'll need to do some planning, because all of these things won't happen by themselves. You know, you have to start to think about how and when you're going to make sure that you're addressing all of these issues. So this is really where we start to see the link that to really end up with FAIR data, you have to start to plan, and you have to build that into your research process from the earliest stages of the work. I just wanted to spend a minute just to look at the concepts of FAIR data and open data. So data that are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable don't necessarily have to be open data. So I think over the last few sessions for the Open Science Café, you will have heard a lot about open science, and that, you know, it's really great to share as much of your research as you can. And we certainly would agree with that. I think Eva and I are both big advocates of data sharing. But there is lots of, you know, good reasons not to share your data. So if you're working with personally sensitive data, you know, about research subjects, interview data, health information, in many cases it would be unethical to share it or illegal to share it. So there are many good reasons not to share the data, but that doesn't mean that you can't make that data fair still. So even though it's not going to be openly shared, you would still want somebody to know that it exists and to know maybe how to go about requesting access to it if they are a legitimate user. So it's important to bear in mind that fair is not the same as open, but that what we would say is that fair and open data are probably where we see the greatest potential value in terms of reuse. So if you have fair data that people can find and access and understand and reuse, and that data is openly reusable to people for whatever purpose, that's where we see the greatest potential value. But they are different concepts. So don't get too confused by the fact that fair and open, don't conflate them. They are different yet related terms. So you heard, I don't think my slides are, oh, they're taking a little bit of time to come through. Sorry about the delay. So you had a talk from Kostas Glinos, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he gave you an overview of some of the research requirements coming out of Horizon Europe. And I think the important stuff to note here is that the European Commission, as well as most of the other global funders, are really getting behind the notion of open science, and this is becoming a core principle that they're all really starting to push. This notion that research that is funded by public money should be made available as a public good. So under Horizon 2020, which was the current big European Commission funding program that we're just coming to the end of, there was a really big push to try and get people to think about making their data open and to share it. What we're seeing now as we're moving into Horizon Europe, which is the next big funding program, which starts this year and runs to 2027, is that this notion about openness, sharing, and sharing of fair data is even stronger in Horizon Europe. So there is a really big commitment on the European Commission side to commit to these principles of openness. And as you can see in the circled bit of this slide, under Horizon Europe, all of the projects that are funded will be expected to come up with a data management plan, and that will be a living document that is assessed periodically throughout the life of the project. So it's really nice to see that the Commission and most of the other global funders are really getting behind the notion of open science and putting that expectation onto the researchers and the organizations that employ researchers to try and make sure that the infrastructure is there to ensure that we do get fair and open data coming out of the research that is supported. So that's a little bit about, you know, why data management is necessary. It certainly is needed if we want to have fair data, and it's necessary to try and think about what should be open and what should be closed. But what is a data management plan? So I think, you know, in a basic sense, it is just a plan about what you will collect, the kinds of formats, the volume of the data that you're going to collect, and trying to think through, you know, what challenges you might encounter. If you're looking to collect lots and lots of data, that may have an impact on where you store it, depending on your organization's capacity. You'll want to think about standards and methodologies. These tend to be subject specific. So working within a discipline, you'll be getting trained as PhD students, you'll be understanding what is good practice within a particular discipline. So the methodologies and how to do good research will be something you're familiar with. And you'll also probably have a good idea about some of the standards that are being used. Other things that we want to address in data management plans are ethics and intellectual property. So again, this is thinking through what can you share and what realistically can't you share. You know, what would it not be ethical to share? If you've got commercial partners or you're doing some research with industry partners, quite often there'll be reasons that you can't share based on commercial sensitivities. So it's thinking through some of these questions and trying to make sure that you are aware of what you can and can't do with the data that you're generating or collecting. Thinking about plans for sharing. So if you're working on a project, quite often you're not working alone. Collaborative research is generally the way we're all working these days. And quite often that's remote. So I'm speaking to you from Glasgow today, and we're all sitting in different rooms, but we can share and access the same files. So it's trying to think how you will use different platforms to share with people that need to have access to your data during the life of the project, but also thinking about what happens after the project. So you might want to publish your data and to make it accessible for others to come back to and to use beyond the life of the project. So we like to think of a DMP as a plan to share. And while that sounds very altruistic, it sounds like you're doing all the work and somebody else is coming and reaping all of your benefits. I think the key thing to remember is that it's not necessarily a plan to share with everyone. It can just be to share with yourself. Quite a lot of the time we come back to our own research a few years down the line. And having good data management really means that you can understand your own data when you're coming back to it after a period of being away, and that can be really helpful. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we're living in a very digital world these days. Everything we do is digital. So while we're really kind of thinking about research data in this talk, all of these kind of issues are worth thinking about for anybody who's managing digital information in their own life. So, we all have digital pictures, music, files. We all do this stuff every day on our phone. So even thinking about some of these things in relation to your own personal digital data is quite useful as well. So hopefully, even if you're not going into a research career, some of these lessons will be useful to you in your own personal life. So some of the things you will want to consider when you're going through writing your data management plan, one of the first things is thinking about where you're going to store the data. So if you're doing research individually, you probably are going to use your own laptop. So you'll be doing your work and it'll sit on your laptop. And that's probably fine, but it's important to remember that laptops get stolen, they get broken, and sometimes you can lose months and months worth of work because you had it all stored on your hard drive of your laptop or on a USB stick that you've lost or it becomes no longer usable. So the best idea is always to use managed storage systems. And for people who work in a university, we always have access to the university's managed systems, which means that the data is getting backed up every day. We don't even have to think about it. So a good idea is if you're working on your own laptop, maybe doing field work, get into the habit of uploading that data into managed storage, maybe every day, every week. Get into the habit of doing it regularly so that you're not in the position that if something is lost or stolen, you have to start from scratch again. So try to think about how you'll do that. Managed storage is always better than just using your own laptop. Another thing that this probably seems very simple, and it is in many ways. When you're working, it's always interesting to people to think about how you're going to name your files. Especially when you're looking to try and work collaboratively. I think everybody can probably recognize what we see at the bottom left hand of the screen. So we might have several, I'm sure Eva recognizes this from the shared drive that we're working on even. We'll have several documents that you might say, this is a workshop report. And it happened in August 2020, and this is the final version. So it's the workshop report 2008-20. final.doc. But then you'll find that there will be several other versions. People will add a couple of modifications. So then you've got final with Joy Davidson edits, then you've got the final, and then you've got the final at another date. And I think this is just, this happens every day. We're all guilty of doing this. But it's important to try to think about how you might structure your file naming and to try and keep it simple and something that people can actually understand and start to apply so that you don't end up with these kinds of messy files where you don't actually know which is the final version of a report. So try to think about how you do this and make sure that you agree that approach with anyone you're working with so that you're all on the same page. I think a key issue, and I know this is one of the areas that Eva is really active in, is metadata and description. It's really trying to think about how do you describe the research outputs that you're generating in such a way that you understand them if you go away from them and come back to them in a few weeks or a few months, but also how anybody else could understand what you've produced. So it's really just thinking what documentation you would need to collect. So it's really that why did you create it, how did you create it, what has happened to the data, have there been any standards used? So thinking about how you start to document this process. This is something called metadata, as I've mentioned, and it really is just a description of what has happened in a structured way and usually using standards so that machines and humans can understand the documentation about the research data. I think the important thing to remember is that it does take a little bit of time to do good contextual information to document your research, but having that context is really important, both for you as the researcher. So if somebody came back to you and questioned how you did something or how you got a particular result, you can answer that. So if you've got good documentation or metadata, you'll understand what happened in your project, and you can stand up to scrutiny. But it also means that there's a greater potential that somebody else can come back to your research and think that there's interesting things in here that I would like to build on, which is always great for you getting cited and getting some impact from your work. So thinking about what sort of documentation you'll need to collect as you go through is something that you would do in a data management plan. It's important to remember that it's good to do the documentation as you go through the life of your research, because it's very, very hard to do it retrospectively. If you get to the end of your project and you're trying to come up with documentation at that point, it's very time consuming, if not impossible to do. So try to build it into your process and make sure that you have a good way of doing that. Metadata, as I mentioned, is basically a description of the data. It's using a structured approach and standards so that these descriptions can be compared and shared across people and systems. So there's different standards used in all sorts of different domains. Depending on what your particular area of research is, there will likely be one, if not many standards that you choose to use when describing your own research data. There's a really nice resource here that has been put together by the Research Data Alliance. So there's a link here to a catalog of different discipline-specific metadata standards. So when you're writing your data management plan, the key thing is don't come up with your own approach to metadata. Make sure you use one of the standards that already exists, because that will give you the greatest potential for that to be interoperable and reusable by somebody else. I think one of the best tips to consider when you're starting your research is where you're going to keep it beyond the life of the project. So once you've finished the project and you've published your data and your articles and the research outcomes, you want to make sure that that can exist somewhere for as long as you need it to exist. So in this respect, it's good to come up with a plan for which digital repository you want to deposit your data in at the end of the project. So thinking about that at the start of the project means that you can look to see if there is a suitable repository that you can use. So the way we recommend researchers think about it is to always go for a discipline-specific repository first. So if your community of practice does provide a dedicated repository, that's your preferred choice to use, because it will already adhere to international standards that are relevant for the domain. There is generally some quality assurance that happens and some curatorial work that happens at the repository. You might also want to use your institutional repository. Your organization actually may have expectations that you share at least the metadata about your outputs within your institutional repository. But there are also generalist repositories. So if there isn't a domain-specific repository that you can use, or an institutional repository that you can use, there are services like Zenodo and Figshare, which are free at the point of use to researchers. So there's always these options that you can come to use to share your data and keep it accessible for the longer term. So the work that we're doing in the FAIRsFAIR project is trying to help come up with some criteria for assessing FAIR enabling capacity for repositories. So we would encourage you, as we're going through this work, to look for a good repository, but also try to find one that is FAIR enabling. And there will be some work done to try and include that into search registries, that ability to search for FAIR enabling repositories. So if you're looking at that early stage to find a suitable repository, it's good to come to Re3 Data. This is a global registry of research data repositories. You can search based on the country that you're working in. You can base your search about your domain area or your subdomain. The catalog filters here get very granular and go into very detailed subdomains within something like the life sciences. So you can get quite granular and look for different repositories that will meet your needs. The other kinds of things you're allowed to do with this registry search is to maybe look for the content type. So it may be that you're not really that concerned about having a repository in your own country or within your own domain, but you might be looking for something that is specifically for looking after image data. So you can start to look for those kinds of repositories that will be the best for looking after that kind of content. So it's always a really good idea to try and think about where you're going to store the data before you get to the actual work of creating your data. And a good tip is when you do choose that repository, have a look at the standards they use for the metadata and try to then reflect that. If you have an eventual home for your data being a particular repository that uses a particular standard, maybe build that into your work so that you're not trying to kind of map between different standards at the end when you're putting something into a repository. So try to use the search tools like this registry to look for places to store your data really at the earliest stage. I think the other thing that you want to think about in your data management planning stages is how you're going to link all of the different outputs that you're producing. So I think everybody's familiar with publishing articles. If you do publish an article with a journal, you will get a digital object identifier, which is a unique and persistent identifier that will always point to that article. And we are seeing that these now exist for things like research data, for software, and for other kinds of outputs. So it's important to think about what you will use and how you will join up these different outputs that you're producing. Because I think the greatest value in terms of your own impact and being able to benefit from sharing your research comes from people being able to join this up. So if somebody finds your journal article, they can then also find the underpinning data so that they understand the findings in the article now are based on this data, and people can check the data for themselves. So we're finding that when you share the data and the article, you're probably going to get more citations because people can actually look at the data and decide how much they trust what you're saying in the article. So it's important to try and think about how you're going to link the different outputs. And there's lots of different persistent identifier schemes like DOIs that will help you to do that. I think the one I've listed here that I think you should also consider is how you would uniquely and persistently identify yourself as a researcher. So ORCID IDs are just that. They're a unique and persistent identifier for researchers, so for people. So anybody can go and register for an ORCID, and if you start to use that, it then means that you have that sort of ability to link yourself to the outputs that you're producing in an unambiguous way. So it's good to try and think about how you're going to contain all of these links and make sure that they're caught when you're going through your research project. It's important to remember when you are thinking about the various things you want to link to. We all understand articles. That's basically how we share research, is through published articles. We're getting much more kind of au fait with sharing data. But I think it's important to remember that there are lots of other things that happen within the research field that we do also think we might want to share. So, models, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, these are some climate change models. In many cases, the model may have more value. So if you spend a lot of time developing a model, the data itself may not be something that's that important to you. Maybe you don't really care if the data that was used on, June 10th is the same as the data that's used on June 20th, but the model is what you really need to keep. So it's understanding what is the most important output for your research and making sure that you can keep that and link it up. So models would be one. Software, again, is another really important thing to think about. So often, researchers will come up with little bits of code that help them to do data analysis. If you don't retain that code and think about how you link to it and attach it to your research, it's very hard for somebody then to validate what you've done, because the code then is really about how you've analyzed that data and what you've done to get your published results. So you do need to make sure that you're looking after software as well. And you can see at the top of the screen, let's not forget the physical samples. Although we have moved largely to work in a digital world, we still do work with physical samples. So, examples are blood samples, medical samples. So you may be using materials in things like biobanks, and you want to make sure that you can link to relevant data that is held in places like that as well, even if it's physical. So it's important to remember that the entire kind of range of things coming out of research, it won't always be digital, but you will want to make sure that you can manage and maintain the links between all of these things as you're planning your research and going through and carrying it out. When you're coming to the point of sharing your data at the end of the project, when you've published your data, it's important to think about how you're going to license it. If you put your data into a repository, primarily you're doing that because you want somebody to come in and build on your work. If you want to get that, it's important that you actually tell people what they can and can't do with your data. So you want to remove any ambiguity about the rights that people have to reuse your data, and Creative Commons is a really good way for anybody who's looking to assign a content license to their data. They offer lots of different ranges that go from CC0, which is essentially waiving any right that you have for what people can do with your data. The one we tend to see most often being used is the CC BY, which is giving you attribution. So we're happy for people to reuse our data, but we want to be attributed as the source of that data. And I think those kind of licenses where you get the attribution are very good to encourage you to use, because it does mean then that hopefully you'll get more citations from your work. So if you've shared it and you've got a license that makes clear what people can do, but you want attribution, then you can see the impact of your work as people start to pick it up and use it. So as I mentioned, Creative Commons is a great resource for that. If you go through there, they have lots of tutorials, they have lots of tools that you can kind of copy and paste, and they do make it very easy to apply a license. So Eva mentioned at the start, the Digital Curation Centre where I work has developed a tool that's been around now for more than 10 years. It's called DMP Online. And this tool is essentially, helps people to write data management plans. So I think, there's nothing more daunting to people than looking at a blank page. So if you're thinking about writing a data management plan, rather than just coming up with that blank page and trying to write it from scratch, we would encourage you to use tools like DMP Online, because what we've done here is to come up with lots of different templates that will help you to structure a data management plan. Most of the work we've done is to try and align the data management plan templates with what funders expect. So if there are specific things they want to see covered in a data management plan, or a specific order that they would expect issues to be addressed, we reflect that in the tool. We also have a lot of organizations, so universities have also set up their own templates, and that is for PhD students and for graduate students. So you might find that there are templates specific to your university where you're studying or working, and these can meet the university's policies related to research data. So this tool is free. Anybody can come and register for an account. You just set up your account, and then you can come in and start creating your own data management plans. As you can see, we've got quite a lot of uptake. More than 89 countries are using our tool, and almost 20,000 different individual researchers are making use of the tool to start to write their plans. So I would encourage you, if you are looking to write a data management plan, to make use of these sorts of tools. This isn't the only tool out there, it's one of many. But one of the benefits, apart from the fact that you've got the kind of template that structures what you need to address in your plan, importantly, they also give you lots of guidance. So if your funder has specific requirements, there will be some guidance on exactly what each question means. So these sorts of tools can help you to write good data management plans. Within this tool, you can choose to collaborate with people to write it. You can share it, you can export it as a PDF. So there are lots of ways that you can use these free tools to be able to write a plan and to manage your plan, and importantly, to come back and update it over the life of your project. So just wanted to wrap up with a couple of slides. One, giving you some tips on what is good practice when you're starting to write your DMP. The first tip here is really to start early in the research project. You should be thinking about what you're going to do in your research before you actually start doing any research. So write your plan when you're thinking about what you're going to do, and as your plan evolves and you get more concrete ideas of what your research will entail, update the plan so that it reflects it. It's good to get guidance when you're writing the plan, and I think most universities in Europe now have some in-house support to help people to do this. So there will be somebody at your institution that you can go to get a bit of advice and guidance. Don't feel that you have to write it in isolation, because I think quite often it's hard to know all of the answers, so make sure that you tap into the expertise that you have available to help you write those plans and answer any questions that you're struggling with. I think the point here, the third point, is it's not about writing a perfect plan. I think it's important not to try to come up with a gold-plated data management plan. The key thing to really do is to focus on what you can actually implement. So write a plan that you can adhere to and that is something you can actually do. So do try to be realistic. Again, update your plan as you go through the research. Things often change, and that's okay. You just want to make sure that the plan reflects what has changed in the project. And do try to make use of these free tools, because, as I said, it's a lot easier to write a data management plan using a template rather than trying to come up with something on a blank piece of paper. Last point here is just, again, to try and focus on some of the benefits. I mean, I think we do talk an awful lot about the fact that research funders expect data management plans, and many research universities and performing organizations also have expectations for data management planning. And it's good to do it for compliance. It's something you will have to do if you go into a career in research. But I think it's also good to take that step back and remember there's lots of benefits to you as a researcher on why you might want to write a data management plan. First and foremost, is hopefully going to avoid you having those scenarios where you've lost a lot of data. So we mentioned before, don't put everything onto a USB drive and leave it there, or a laptop. Use the managed storage and make sure that you're not going to be in a position where you're losing your data. It does, as we mentioned, help you to get fair data, and planning to make your data fair and trying to think about what you'll do to make your data fair will take the time and effort. But it should give you some more impact for your research. So as I mentioned, having public papers and data does generally result in higher citations. So it should help you to get more impact for your work. It will support research integrity and validation. And this is really, research integrity is a growing concept. I think we're seeing this really, again, in Horizon Europe as a key theme. So we want to be able to ensure that any data that people are publishing is something that people can scrutinize, and that if there are any questions, we can go back to the researcher and understand how they've done something, and to understand if things are going to be able to be validated or not. So it's definitely something that's in your best interest to make sure that you're keeping in line with research integrity. And it also makes it easier to collaborate. If everybody's clear about what you're doing within a project regarding the data and how it's being managed and shared, it just means that people are all on the same page. So a data management plan actually is a good blueprint to use, so that when you've got research assistants coming on, maybe in the middle of a project, they're as up to date on what is happening within the project as those who were involved from the start. So it does help to make people's lives a little bit easier in terms of collaboration. And I think it's important to remember that good research data management and sharing leads to real world benefits. And I think we're seeing that just now with the COVID crisis and the fact that we have now gotten to the stage where there's not just one vaccine, but many, many vaccines in development and going into people's arms is all the result of people sharing data early and trying to really embrace this notion of working towards a common goal. So it does actually have a real benefit in the real world. So remember that it's not just a box ticking exercise. It definitely is something that's worth doing and doing properly. So I think at that I will stop and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Joy. I think it has been a terrific and very clear presentation. I was just trying to do your work on the go, since I know that you cannot see the chat. I was trying to answer some questions and giving meta information, what you were saying.
Okay, excellent.
Copy and paste link and stuff like that. But also they are very interesting questions, and there is a parallel debate on something that we have been working very much on the FAIRsFAIR project about the trust. Remember that we were working on trust and fair, the trustworthiness of the repositories, and also it was a discussion about if the university repository that is now in the process of getting the core trust seal certification, which is for the repositories, and Zenodo trustworthiness, but they say that Zenodo is trustworthy because it's commission funded. So it's they can guarantee that they will maintain it in open air and the CERN and also the commission. So they are repositories, they don't need to guarantee their own trustworthiness, but the others we have to apply for the trust. What do you think is the best way to get the trustworthiness of a repository? Applying for the core trust seal or some other interesting path that we can consider?
I mean, I think core trust seal or other certified status is definitely a great way to get evidence that you're doing something that could be considered trustworthy. I don't think it's right for every repository. It does take quite a bit of time and effort, and I think there's an awful lot of things that smaller repositories can do to increase their trustworthiness, and that might just be about transparency, being clear on what data you collect, being clear on what happens to it, who has access to it, how long it's going to be retained, and crucially, if there is some sort of an exit plan. So if the repository, for whatever reason, fails to exist or it doesn't get funding to continue, that there's an exit plan, that the data will go somewhere else. So there's things that people can do to increase the transparency about what happens within the repository system, and that's just good practice. I think every repository should be trying to make that clear to potential end users.
Also, I don't know if I just somebody that wants to ask the question in real time, you just can open your microphone and just go through. And I think you have no access to the chat, right? Also, there was a question about what you mentioned. You can see it. There was another discussion about when you mentioned use free software. Somebody asked if it is free and open source software, and I think you probably will refer to only to openly available, free of use, but I don't know if you also refer to open source software.
And I think, in general, within the open science context, free and open source is the way to go with software. But I think with the data management planning, the point I was referring to is that quite often researchers will write little bits of bespoke code. It may not be free and open source. It may just be that they've done something to allow them to analyze the data in a way that they're hoping to get a particular insight. Whether they want to share that publicly is one thing. So they may wish to share that for others to reuse. But as part of research integrity and validation, if you have done something that allows you to get a result So if you've used a bit of software that does some calculations and gives you a result, it's important to make sure that you keep that as part of the research, because without understanding how that bit of code did something to the data, it's hard to know then if if there was a bug or a problem at some point within the software. It's impossible to know if the data is trustworthy. So it's yes, it's good to use free and open source software, but if you're doing any kind of research development in your own project, it's also good to keep it, whether it's open or not, for research validation, and to make sure that that's planned for. So hopefully that distinction is a bit clearer.
There is a question, but it's administrative about certificates. You know that Spain just we live in certification of every single thing that we do. So far. And also there is another interesting question from Emma Crespo, that she asked us about any suggestion for a template, of any suggestion for a suitable data management template for a CSA, the program proposal. I will tell you, Emma, before asking Joy for her advice, that for a proposal you don't need a DMP. If you are funded, that you have to make the data management plan. In the proposal, you have to refer how are you going to deal with the data, but not to make a proper data management plan, that it will be considered as a deliverable in month 6 of a proposal that is granted. Is right what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I think under Horizon 2020, there certainly was that you had it within the first 6 months. I think within Horizon Europe, there's, like you say, I think they want to see evidence that you're thinking about these things. You don't necessarily have to the formal DMP, but there is going to be a section, I think, under the excellence and the organizational capacity,
yeah,
where they want to know how you're addressing open science, and also, your capacity to do what you're planning to do. So even though you don't actually have to have the full DMP for the proposal, it is a good idea to start thinking, writing it out, and within DMP Online we have templates for the European Commission. So we certainly have one for Horizon 2020, and we'll be working for one that goes into Horizon Europe. This should help you to do it. But I think to provide credible information at the proposal stage, going through excuse me, the DMP questions can give you that excuse me, frog in my throat. It can give you that sort of credibility for your response.
And this is another good question for Antonio de la Oliva, that he's also preparing these kind of things. What is the expected level at the proposal phase?
At the proposal phase, as Eva mentioned, it is an outline. So it's very much feeding into different sections of what they assess. So European Commission proposals are funded under 3 headers. One is the scientific excellence, one is on the potential impact, and the other one is on the capacity to do the work.
Implementation.
Yeah, so they're kind of practical aspects of can you actually deliver what you said you're going to do in the proposal. What we're seeing from the initial information coming out of Horizon Europe is that they're expecting to see open science covered under excellence. So they do, and that's great to see, because what they're saying there is that it is part of the excellence of the research. They want to have some idea of how you're going to address open science as part of that section. I think they're limiting it to 2 pages. 1 to 2 pages would be the expected amount they would expect in the proposal at that stage. At the other end of that, they also want to see it addressed in the implementation side. So, if you're saying we're going to share things using certain platforms, and protected information will be safeguarded and only provided to those who have legitimate access, then you might want to make that clear in the implementation side, that you have a partner in the proposal that has the right infrastructure to allow that to happen. So we are seeing it's filtering into the very different areas of the proposal, and it is being addressed, but the DMP itself is something that comes within the 6 months of being funded, and is something that you would update over the life. So hopefully that gives you a good starting point.
Yeah, thank you. And also it was at this point, he said it was a discussion also with the Spanish Agency of Research, that at the beginning, in the first attempt, when they were starting to require data management planning, they put the proposal has to have a data management plan. And in the Committee of Open Science at the Spanish level, we said you cannot ask for the open data management plan if the limit of pages is 20, because a data management plan can have 20 pages itself. And also the restriction that the Commission has about the proposal level not ask you for the full-fledged data management plan is that there are domains that to make a proper data management plan is very expensive. They have to just pay for their storage. They have to think about, you know, copies and prevention and analyzing IPRs. And it could be millions of issues that you have to address. So if you are not going to pay me, why I will do this? So that's why it came to the real funded proposals. But at the evaluation level, I agree with you, because now it's going to be evaluated in excellence, and also as a operational capacity that you can deal with the data that you got. I mean, it can be an open document, as we mentioned many times, but you have to demonstrate that you think about these kind of things. And also there is a question from somebody in the chat.
Just to pick up on, I think the other thing is to remember, you know, while you don't have to do the plan at the proposal stage, it is worth going through and thinking about all of these issues, because there are, as Eva mentioned, costs associated. So if you have to anonymize a lot of data in order to share it, you want to build those costs into the proposal. Most funders, including the European Commission, will allow eligible costs, but you want to make sure you capture those in the grant proposal and don't find out about it once you've got your budget set and you can't go back. So
exactly, that's a very good point. Very good point. Think over before, just when you don't have to deal with the data, you don't find something that is very expensive that you didn't have projected. So that's a fantastic point. Yeah. And also there are some other questions that well, Esther was asking about what would be the most interesting tool to gather all your data, to collect your data, to share your data when you are a PhD student, that you have several machines, the laptop, the uni, PC, and other things. How can you keep all your data and all the things together without very time-consuming approaches? And I recommend her to use Open Science framework that allows you to keep some data openly available, and some you can have them restricted, and it just let you deal with the whole research cycle. But this is my advice. Perhaps you have some other ideas.
I think electronic lab notebooks and these kind of things like Jupyter are becoming more increasingly used, maybe more in the life sciences for you know, doing that kind of work. But there are, I think it's tricky, and the reality is we do work in multiple environments. We're never going to just work in one place. So I think the data management plan can reflect that. I don't think you have to move to one all or nothing. I think having a data management plan that says some data will be held here, and this is what will happen. Some data will be sitting over here, and you know, I think we just have to reflect the fact that we do work in a hybrid environment. So.
There is also there is another point here about the somebody answer. I just get lost. Somebody answered to her in the GitHub repository, but also mentioning that it's not recommended for massive data, which is a good thing. Again, it depends. Everything, the data, they are use cases. Like every single case, every single research is a data management plan. It's an output management plan, as we recommended in the Open Science Policy Platform. And you have to consider which discipline and which kind of data do you deal with. If you have massive data, you have to probably apply for storage and cost about this. So, but GitHub is another interesting repository to keep things together?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no shortage of places, and I think if you go to the Re3 Data tool that we pointed out in the talk, there's thousands of repositories out there, and they all deal with, you know, lots of discipline-specific information or, you know, software-specific types of outputs. So there's no shortage of places to store your data. It's just finding the one that's right for you and making sure that you can make an informed choice about where you're storing it. And, you know, understanding your own requirements, again, through the data management planning, can help you to make the right choice about where you're going to put your data and to keep it for the longer term.
Yeah. I think Joy is frozen now.
Oh, am I?
Joy?
Oh, no.
No. Okay. No,
Okay.
you come back. I say, well, it was at the end.
Still for a minute.
Just at the end, it doesn't matter. I don't know if we have any other questions, some other comments. I have also a comment about the data management plan, because where we have Costas in the first session, he was mentioned other outputs of the research that this has to be also considered. What are you going to do at this proposal level, probably planning level? But we recommended it, as I mentioned to you, in the Open Science Policy Platform, to make an output management plan, like all the things that you are going to have as an output of your project. Just try to think over what is the level of openness that you can afford, and just plan it, because it will be always a good thing to do. Do you think this is a good thing about this?
I do. I think actually using the data management plan as a sort of a hub of all of the different outputs is a really good idea. And we're starting to see more and more people are publishing the data management plans. Actually, as you go through and you update your DMP, at the end of the project, you might choose to publish it. And I think in some countries like Switzerland, they actually require you to publish an end-stage DMP. And that is a really useful thing, because it's not a plan for what you want to do. It then becomes an actual, this is what we did. And it's a useful resource then for context. So if somebody finds your data sets and you can link to the DMP, you get a clearer idea of how it was managed and what was done to it over the life of the project. So I think it's useful to try and think about how we can use the DMP as a way to link between the various different outputs and to show how they were all managed during the life of the project.
And also we have a question from Belen that is from the library, from the unit of open science to the university that she's working on this kind of topics. And she's asking about a significant difference, if there are significant difference between the Horizon 2020 and the ERC templates. I have in one of the slides that I mentioned in the previous section with the doctoral students, the URL to the recommendations of both organizations. But I'm assuming that under Horizon Europe, they will be the same recommendations. But because Horizon 2020 is already finished, there are not more proposals under Horizon 2020. This is the recommendations. And I don't know if you have any other further information about this. This is the ERC.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how close they'll be. I would imagine they'll be closer in the next round of Horizon Europe. I think the ERC templates are really great because they have been looking at FAIR data for a long time. So the ERC FAIR data management is really embedded into it. And it is in the European Commission ones as well. But I think the ERC has done a lot to come up with really good guidance as well, and discipline-specific guidance. So they have done a lot of work to try and help the researchers applying for grants to understand, you know, what repositories should I be putting my data in for my particular discipline. So they've done not just the template, but they've done a lot of work on the guidance as well. So I think ERC is a really great example to have a look at.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we are just about arriving to our time. I don't know if we have a last question, last comment. I don't know if I just leave something behind. if I left something behind, just excuse me. One more question. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. That has been great, actually.
Well, thanks for everybody for giving up an hour of your time to come and talk about data management plans. That's been great.
I think it's a fantastic discussion, and I'm very happy that our researchers, they are keen on getting on this adventure, which is not very easy, and also it's time consuming. It's very particular for the field and domain, and also, but the university is happy to help them, and we are trying to just strong our training on this. So thank you very much for being part of this, Joy, and for putting us
thanks for the invitation.
So clear message. And
okay,
the next time we will have you again in the University Carlos III, and in real time.
Yeah, that would be nice. In real place. Sounds great.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
See you in the next Open Science Cafe. That next week is about citizen science, which is something that it will be also considered in the Horizon Europe. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.